Yeah, there was so I did graduate school at George Mason University. Anyways, the one of the guys that was in the conflict resolution department, he talked this philosopher, his name was Ram Hare, who was from Oxford. He was one of like Cherry Warner's friends and
Oh, cool.
buddies at Oxford. Anyways, he talked him into teaching this class in the conflict resolution department. And so some of his theories, like he specifically had one that was called positioning theory, that basically says like how I position myself. There's like a position call that I issue to you. So like for instance, like if I'm in a negotiation, right? If you and I are in a conflict and we have like a mediation, and I speak first, and I say, well, the problem is that Carl's a jerk because of this reason, this reason, this reason, and this reason, right? So I've created a position for myself and a position for you. And
Right.
so what typically happens in a negotiation is because I've gone first and I've outlined the conflict, is that typically, so I've issued what's called a position call to you. And so then you're going to look at it and be like, well, I'm not a jerk because of this, and this. But what you've done is that you've agreed to the framework.
Right.
You've agreed to the framework, but you feel like you have to dispute it, but you're arguing within my logic of how I
Right.
framed it.
Right. I
And
have
so
to.
this is
Yes. Yeah.
so this is positioning theory. So in conflict resolution, they grabbed on to this to this guy because he was like he wrote like all this like whole books on how like this positioning theory, like how it works. So anyways, I take this class with this Oxford professor, and he's like from New Zealand originally, and I don't think this guy was 5 feet tall. He like looked like he was like straight from like Hogwarts,
Not
like, and
imposing.
the way that he talked, like he was like legit, like he looked like he was like a Hogwarts like
That's awesome.
professor. So he would then talk about like positioning theory and all of this like stuff, and he'd have like these examples that he had like researched on like soccer hooligans and like stuff like. Anyways, all these like the way the pronouns were, like the way that pronoun, like he was a world expert on pronouns and the way that they work and like positioning and really fascinating stuff, right? Well, inevitably you'd have like you have all these students that are there to study like conflict, and they'd ask him like questions, be like, yeah, but how does this theory like apply to like the genocide in Rwanda? Which was like, anyways, like that was always like kind of, for some reason, like the genocide in Rwanda, I think because it was like more recent,
Yeah.
like you
That
could
was
get into
that
like why this,
was a
like how
big
this,
thing to say we need to like solve that.
yeah, because it's like, oh, this is nice and all, like, but what does pronouns have to do with a genocide in Rwanda? And he'd get like some kind of question like that. And so here he's like probably the smartest person that any of us are going to meet. And he would just be like, well, I don't know. I'm not an expert in the genocide in Rwanda, so I can't speak to it.
Right. So he understood positioning enough that he didn't say I have to engage in the positioning you're presenting.
Yeah, but he knew what he knew and he knew what he didn't know.
Right. Right.
He understood positioning. They're like he wrote the book on it, and so people would try to be like, "We want you to be this this analyst,"
Right.
and he would refuse it, and he'd just be like, I don't know." He's like, "I couldn't speak to the genocide in Rwanda." I'm like, I don't have expertise. Anything that I would say about it would just be my opinion, which is no better than
It's
anyone's in this class. So
really,
as a
really
professor, I don't have anything to profess
it's really
about that.
fascinating to me because I think about it a lot, like how problematic ego can be. And usually, the more renowned you are, the more that you've accomplished, the more books you've written, the more people are sitting in front of you to hear what you have to say. It's hard to fight that sense that I should know the answer. I find
Yeah, that
this professor very impressing that he goes, I don't have to know the answer. I just have to participate. And if
well
somebody, yeah,
he knew. Yeah, I mean, it was like, to me what was incredible about it, and it was like a lot of the professors, you'd ask them and they would know. And if you ask them about what, like they'd have something to say about probably anything, you know? But it was like here, this was like the smartest and most accomplished professor that I've ever been around.
Right.
And I've never seen a professor like admit that he didn't know something more than him.
Yeah.
He was like, I mean, he was at the end of his career, you know, he was like in his like late 70s. So it's like this guy had been in academia for a long time. He knew a lot,
Yeah. Well,
but he was very clear on what he didn't know. And so it was like it was very refreshing. And people get so frustrated, man. They were like people hated his class. They're like, I don't get it. Like
yeah.
I don't get it. And I'm like, you have to understand like who he is. Like he came here by invitation to teach. Like he's not a conflict professor.
Well, and also, like, why is it on him to answer this question? Like, why don't you say how it does or doesn't apply to Rwanda? What I really think is interesting about it, as I think about it more, is it really speaks to his objective in the moment. Like, if I become a professor because I want people to think I'm smart, well, then I always need to be the smartest guy in the room, right? And I always need to have an answer. You know what I mean? I always need to defend that. But if I'm just joining somebody in an exploration of a thought, and maybe I'm leading the discussion, but I'm just exploring it and I'm just being open and honest, and that's my objective, I never have to know the answer. And it says something really interesting about like the way that he saw himself in it and what his objective was. It didn't.
Yeah, I mean, his objective was to teach like what he had expertise in,
Yeah.
and not and no further than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he was very clear on it. He was like, if I speak on that, I'm just giving you my opinion. And
That I
he's like,
don't.
my opinion's not any better than anybody else's in this room. Like that's like but I'm not. But he's like, I'm not gonna do that.
Yeah.
So it's like it's just. I mean, to me, it was like, and again, like he had no ego. You know, it wasn't like, well, ask me about something that I know so I can be astounded, like amazing. He didn't care about that. It was like he was like one of those rare people where you look at like if you want to talk about a man of science, that it was like he knew what he knew, like what he had researched. He knew what he knew, and he knew what he didn't know, and
Yeah.
it's very very clear to him. And I that was probably the most profound thing. And so you talked about like positioning, right? Like this is the guy that wrote the book on positioning theory, where everybody wants to position themselves as an expert.
Yeah.
Come listen to me. And he was very clear on what his position was. He was there to, in his mind, even though he was in this department that he did, I don't think that he fully understood because he wasn't a conflict resolution
Right.
professor. He was very clear on what his position was and what it wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody nowadays, because it's like, I mean, even like us, like, you know, like we have like a podcast where we're like sitting here talking about stuff, but what do we know? You know, not much. Like, what do we actually have expertise in? You know, like, not much. I still think it's like, it's okay because neither of us are showing up. Like, we're not coming into this podcast to talk a bit. We're the experts that know something.
Yeah.
It's just like we're two friends that like love each other and enjoy talking to each other and want to explore different topics. And so that's okay.
Yeah.
But
It's fun to join with people that are just curious.
yeah, but you're just curious and you can have like that's a different type, like that's a different type of conversation because that's an exploration.
Yeah.
And so that's the way that we're positioning ourselves cuz you know, it's like even when you ask, like, do I believe in an afterlife? You know, like, yeah, I do. I believe I believe in, do I think I'm an expert on that? Do I have like unequivocal faith in that situation? Could I like speak convincingly of it to other people? I would say that that's between them and God. It's not between me and them.
It's a fun question, and it was fun to talk to you about it because really I don't care about if there is or isn't an afterlife. I'm really trying to understand you, because
Yeah, no, exactly.
you of value, and I find you interesting, and I find the way that you are in life to be something I could learn from. And so it was really fun for me to put
Yeah, and vice
an
versa.
open question out there and just see, like, and I loved that you're like, yeah, I think so. And you didn't, like, you didn't try, like I said, you didn't try and prove it and say, well, there has to be.